I am Senior Director of Treatment Services at Wayside Recovery Center, and today we are going to be talking about boundaries. So, a quote I'm going to read to you about boundaries is from the Nursing Board, and it says, "Professional boundaries are defined as the space between the professional's power and the client's vulnerability. The power of the professional comes from the position we hold and the access to private knowledge about the client. Awareness is the key. Professionals who are clear about their own needs and the needs of their clients and who can separate the personal from the professional will find themselves acting in the best interest of their clients. The responsibilities to maintain boundaries is always on the professional. So it's incredibly important that we understand how to maintain professional boundaries, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we want to maintain a distinction between a personal relationship and a professional relationship. In personal relationships, there isn't an implicit power differential. So personal relationships with your family members, your friends. In a professional relationship, however, there is the both implicit and explicit power differential. So there's a line between the self of client and self of worker. And there is an ethical framework within which the worker-client relationship occurs, and we need to be aware of the ethics surrounding boundaries. And that is in order to limit possible exploitation and also to promote a trauma-informed environment. So some of the core values of trauma-informed care include safety, empowerment, collaboration, trust, and choice. And so obviously we want to avoid exploiting the client relationship, and so that involves safety and empowerment. And collaboration also includes doing that in a way that acknowledges the staff-client relationship in a professional way, and that because of that there's trust and there's also choice. Failure to maintain strong boundaries can lead to violations of confidentiality or privacy, discrimination or favoritism, maltreatment such as coercive behavior and or emotional or financial abuse, and board or licensing sanctions. There are other risks as well, and those are some of the major ones we want to keep in mind. So why do we want to pay attention to these boundaries? Well, again, we want to really reduce the risk of client exploitation or any harm befalling the client because of boundary violations. We also want to reduce client anxiety as rules and roles are clear between yourself as a professional and the role for the client. It also increases the well-being of the staff, that our personal needs are met outside of the workplace, and we want to provide role modeling of healthy relationships for clients. So who is in charge of maintaining boundaries? Like I said before, it is the professional's responsibility, not the client's, to maintain boundaries at all times. It is your duty as the worker to act in the best interest of the client 100% of the time, and you are therefore ultimately responsible. So why is it the worker that is responsible? Well, you are the professional, and so clients may not be aware of the need for boundaries or even are able to defend themselves against boundary violations. The clients that we work with in residential treatment are considered vulnerable adults, and there is an inherent power imbalance between worker and client. Worker is perceived as having the power control, and we have the code of ethics to uphold in our profession. So here are some boundary issues that you might or might not be aware of. One of them is our competence and scope of practice. It's really important to know what areas are within your practice and what is the scope of the responsibilities and tasks that you have. So, for example, assisting someone when you do not have the knowledge or training in a particular area. So, for example, if you've never been trained on how to do a suicide assessment and you have a client who might be presenting some suicidal ideation, it might be important in that case to recognize that you have a limited area of competence and to get someone involved who has that area of expertise or competence. Another boundary issue is giving or receiving gifts. We really want to understand that gift giving can also be something that clients are doing, and they just might be wanting to show gratitude. However, unfortunately, there can be some boundary violations that can happen when clients are giving or receiving gifts. And so in that case, we absolutely want to consult with our supervisor. And the general rule out there is to not accept any gifts that might be valued over $10. Other boundary issues such as dual relationships or conflict of interest. Other boundary issues are becoming friends or socializing with clients. If we're encouraging dependence, and of course the big one is physical contact or sexual relationships are always a no. So here are some danger zones. If you feel like you're over-identifying with the client's issues. So, for example, if a client discloses to you they just had a loved one pass away, and you just had a loved one pass away, and so you're over-identifying with some of the grief that the client has experienced, and perhaps you're feeling some sort of validation and listening to the client, or you're spending more time with the client, you may inadvertently start talking about your own personal experiences or what's happening for you, and a relationship that might be forming there, conversations might be forming there that are overstepping boundaries. And so if you have that awareness of over-identifying with client issues, you can stop it and seek consultation with your supervisor immediately and be really mindful in relationship with the client. If you are experiencing physical or emotional attraction to the client, that could be another danger zone. It happens, but the important thing is if you are experiencing an attraction or an emotional attraction to the client, that you immediately seek consultation with your supervisor and disclose it to someone, so that you can get assistance in how to be mindful, and how to be aware and conduct yourself in order to protect both yourself and the client. Another danger zone is gaining rewards from the clients or the client's influence. And so again, if you would have a client who maybe had some sort of influence or notoriety or some sort of fame, and you were trying to gain rewards from that, that would be a danger zone, and we want to be aware, and again, seek supervision immediately if you notice that this is happening. Transference or countertransference often happens frequently in our work with the client. Clients might remind you of somebody. The client might disclose to you that you remind them of somebody in their life. You could have an experience with a client that reminds you of another experience that you've had in life, and that triggers some different emotions in you. Or conversely, that could trigger some different emotions for the client that might disclose that if they pop up and come out sideways, it could be a danger. And so if you are experiencing in relationship with the client, feeling that they're reminding you of someone close to you or in your family or somebody you've had a bad or positive or really positive experience with, disclosing that to your supervisor and talking about how that's coming up for you in the workplace can be really important to navigating that. And then another danger is self-disclosure. So at Wayside, because we utilize relational cultural theory, which is another training that you'll receive, the staff do some minimal forms of self-disclosure in order to maintain a level of authenticity and relationship with the client. However, self-disclosure needs to be done for the benefit of the client, and there still needs to be plenty of boundaries in what you self-disclose. If you've never experienced self-disclosure at work or in a professional work setting before, particularly working with vulnerable adults, before you try self-disclosure, talk with your supervisor on how to do that in a way that's therapeutic for the client and is about the client and not yourself. Some things that you would not ever self-disclose is where you live, your phone number, very personal information. And it is often recommended that you don't self-disclose anything that you're currently working through or working on yourself. So some guidelines for self-disclosure. Again, self-disclosure should always be in the best interest of the client and for their benefits, not your own. Sometimes in this field, colleagues, for the benefit of the client, have self-disclosed their own experience of being a member of community and recovery, just for one example of a form of self-disclosure that takes place in the work setting that you might overhear. There's other types of self-disclosure that could be for the benefit of the client, and again, I really encourage you to navigate those things with your supervisor. Make sure the self-disclosure is relevant to the client and disclosed for a specific purpose. And self-disclosure requires judgment about when, what, and how much to share with the client. And self-disclosure is done to facilitate relationship building, the professional relationship, not a personal relationship with the client. I also really encourage you for some self-disclosure to make sure you document and again seek plenty of supervision. So, questions to ask in examining potential boundary issues. Is this in the client's best interest? So if a client draws you a card to give thanks to you in terms of, for example, providing you a gift, the gift is the card, is accepting the card in the client's best interest? If we look at it and we think to ourselves, the card was homemade, it was made with things that were around Wayside in our arts and crafts department, so it wasn't made with the client's own material. And the value of the card is likely under $10, and the client is trying to show thanks or gratitude for you. The bigger harm could be by saying, no, I don't want the card, no thank you, and not accepting the card. And so in this case, accepting the card could potentially be the thing that we want to do in that case, because the bigger harm may be in not accepting the card. That is something that you really need to look at and explore on a case-by-case basis. But again, always asking yourself, is this in the client's best interest? Whose needs are being served? In this case, by accepting the card that the client made you, the need that they're having is to show gratitude. If, for example, you're accepting the card for your own need because maybe it makes you feel like you were a helper, made you feel good, and did not have anything to do with the client, then I would probably explore that a little bit more in terms of the decision to accept the card. We definitely want to make sure that when we're looking at potential boundary issues, that the client's needs are being served and not our own. Does the client mean something quote unquote special to me? These are huge places where boundary violations can occur. So if there is some sort of, again, going back to attraction to the client, strong emotional connection, feels like they're feeling some need for you, those are going to be huge slippery slopes where you could potentially be making decisions that could be incredibly harmful to the client and subsequently yourself. Asking yourself, am I taking advantage of the client? So are you asking them to do something? For example, you go out to start your car at the end of the day and your car isn't starting. You happen to know that one of your clients is a mechanic. If you went into the building and asked them to take a look at your car, that would be taking advantage of the client in that case. So that would be a serious boundary violation. And so in that case, you would say no. You would not go in and ask a client to look at your car. You would call somebody outside the agency, AAA mechanic, but we wouldn't utilize the client because that would be clearly taking advantage of the client's knowledge as a mechanic. Am I being sensitive to potential trauma? So looking at different things that we're doing in the framework and looking at the client's trauma history. How would I feel telling a colleague or my supervisor about this? So whatever the situation is, whether it's a conversation about a client, if you're ever getting the urge of, ooh, I wouldn't want a colleague to know that I had this conversation, or I wouldn't feel comfortable with this conversation getting out, or what I did, or the behaviors that happened, I wouldn't want somebody else to know about it, Generally, that means that there's either a potential of a boundary infraction or a boundary issue, or that there was a boundary issue. So in that case, if you ever have that feeling, stop what you're doing, or seek consultation or supervision immediately. We definitely want to feel confident in what we're doing with our clients, that we would be able to tell our colleagues, we'd be able to document what's happening, and that we would feel good about that. And then how would I feel charting about this? I've also heard people say, how would you feel if what you did was on the front page of the newspaper? Would that be okay with you? What would other professionals or colleagues in your same job scope be doing in this situation? Those are questions that you can ask yourself in order to know whether or not there's potential boundary issues or boundary issues have occurred. Another situation is the idea of dual relationships, and this is when you have more than one role with a client, and we want to try to avoid dual relationships as much as humanly possible, because such relationships can blur boundaries. So blurring those boundaries increases the risk of exploitation, as roles can become confusing. So again, it's our responsibility to manage or minimize dual relationships, not the client's. So if you hear that your cousin potentially might be admitting on Tuesday, and this is the first you're hearing about it, you would absolutely want to inform your supervisor immediately, because if the client admits, there would now be a dual relationship, one with you as the professional and then also you as their cousin. And so that would be two relationships that you have with the client, and thus a dual relationship, which can lead to dual boundaries. So some dual relationships are unavoidable. So for example, you and a client belong to the same church. A client works at a local business that you frequent. Your agency hires clients as staff or utilizes clients as volunteers. And so if you do enter in a dual relationship, for example, you do go to the same church as a client, you do want to inform your supervisor and make that dual relationship known as soon as you become aware of it yourself. So make sure you have an open and honest discussion with clients on the nature of your relationship. So for example, if on Sunday you realize you go to the same church, on Monday when you're both in the office, you'd want to make sure that the client is also aware of the dual relationship. Perhaps they didn't know that you also went to that church, and have an honest discussion of what does that mean when you see the client on the outside, at church or in the community, and your responsibility as a professional to uphold client confidentiality and maintain that dual relationship, and that there's separate functions by location. So who you are at work and the separate function that you hold as a professional, and then the function that is served when you're at church, for that example, where you go to the same church. Again, letting the client be known and aware of the threats to confidentiality, and understand your role as a professional. And again, and I'll probably say this 50 more times, seek supervision. So when there's a conflict of interest with a dual relationship, and that can often affect your motivation and decision making in working with that client. So for example, if you also perhaps do sales on the weekends, or you have another job that you do sales, and the client is also a client of your sale company, and it's really important for you that potentially they discharge from treatment early so that you can continue to sell them something, right? That's a conflict of interest, because you have a dual relationship. You're a professional at Wayside, and you also have a different business, and in that business you're also engaging in monetary there's a monetary gain for you with that client. And so that's going to affect your motivation and your decision making and working with the client. And we would A, want to avoid that dual relationship at all costs, and B, we want to disclose that conflict of interest because of there also being a business relationship. So unfortunately, that particular example, because that dual relationship and the conflict of interest, that has a huge potential for exploitation if not handled correctly. So a conflict of interest must be avoided so that exploitation does not occur. And so by letting your supervisor know, we can work on avoiding having that conflict of interest exist and find strategies So, minimizing risk of exploitation. You must be alert to potential or actual conflicts of interest. If you do have other jobs, volunteer activities, other employment, and you know or become aware of clients also engaging in any of those realms in your life, it's very important that you seek supervision and inform somebody immediately. Be aware that isolation is often a major factor in ethical violations. If you have unmet needs in your personal life and you're trying to get those needs met in relationship to others at your workplace, that can also be a red flag where ethical boundaries might occur. So do make sure you meet your personal needs in other areas of your life and not at work. Keep the relationship focused on the client at all times. So avoid bringing things back to yourself. Avoid bringing back to conversations about yourself for the sake of talking about yourself. Continually build a clear understanding of ethics and attention to professional boundaries. So it's very important that you continue with ethics training, go to ethics training, talk about ethical standards, read about ethical standards in the field, and continue supervision and dialogue and training in this area. Maintain good supervision and consultation in relationships. So I'm going to run through some scenarios that could happen while you're employed at Wayside or happen in the field, and we can kind of discuss them. Scenario number 1, a client has been in residential treatment for 30 days, is not attending much programming, and hasn't been doing a lot of treatment plan work. We are at the point of needing to request a funding extension for her or discharge her from the program. So in this case, the client is needing an extension for funding, right? And yet they're not demonstrating that they're doing programming, and they've been in treatment already for 30 days, and they're not doing their treatment plan. So there are some ethical considerations to take into account here, as we want to look at the client's level of need, what they're demonstrating their need, what have we done for client interventions. We definitely don't want to keep the client in treatment, for example, just for funding or exploitation. We'd want to be honest with the client about what their goals are and be authentic in terms of what do they see as ongoing benefits to treatment. So we want to be careful not to exploit the client or commit any fraud, waste, or abuse, and we want to seek consultation and discuss what would be the ongoing benefit for the client to stay in treatment, what are their level of need, what are the risks and benefits to keeping them in treatment, and engage and cooperate with the treatment in their own treatment plan, with the client in their own treatment planning and in own decision making in terms of, do we request an extension, or are we looking at a transfer or discharge, possibly to a lower level of care if they've demonstrated that, or what are their continued goals. Scenario number 2. A client asks you to write them a letter of recommendation to the court for her child protection case. In this scenario, what we're looking at is scope of practice, and that is a potential boundary violation, as we had discussed earlier. So a client is asking you, in whatever your job role or where you've been hired, to write a letter of recommendation to the court for her child protection case. So this is asked of us a lot as we work with clients in various roles that we have. And the question is, are you an individual who can make such recommendation? So in general, for most people in the roles at Wayside, we do not have the expertise in order to give a recommendation on what somebody should be doing in child protection case. And so if you ever have doubt about whether or not it's within your scope of practice to write a letter of recommendation to a probation officer, child protection worker, sometimes clients ask for letter recommendations for renters or a job. If you get asked something like that and it's not clear to you whether that's within your scope of practice to do, please consult with your supervisor to determine if that's within your scope. Scenario number 3. A client comes to you and asks if she can talk about a private matter and if you will please not tell other staff. So here the client is trying to have a discussion with you. Potentially they feel safe with you. However, this is a slippery slope because they're also trying to develop a special relationship with you whereby you hold secrets for them. And really, again, going back to, is this something that you would feel comfortable telling another colleague, and being authentic with clients that we do not hold secrets, and that we would need to either consult or talk to colleagues if we felt like it met that level that we would need to. There are some things that clients tell us that we don't really necessarily feel like it meets that level where we absolutely need to consult with somebody, and we can be authentic with client. For example, if a client says, hey, I just bought a new car, that's not necessarily something we would announce in staff meeting that a client bought a new car. It's not relevant, it's not needed. However, that's also not likely the client would ask us to keep it a secret. Generally, if a client is asking us to keep something secret, more likely or not, it is something that we're going to need to consult around, or it's something that we're going to need to seek supervision with somebody around, or let somebody know for the safety of a client or someone else. In addition, we are mandated reporters, so if a client discloses child abuse or elder abuse, abuse to vulnerable adult, or exploitation, we would need to definitely report that. So we can't in good faith tell a client that we can keep a secret. So instead, if a client comes to you and asks if you will please not tell staff, we do need to let the client know what the limits of confidentiality are, our role as mandated reporters, and also that we do seek supervision and consultation when necessary, and you would need to talk to somebody if you felt it met that level of degree. Scenario number 4, a former client has been emailing with you, first for support and to let you know how she is doing. Then she invites you to get coffee with her to catch up in person. So again, this is a scope of practice issue. It's also an exploitation issue. It's also a dual relationship issue. If you are, for example, a peer support specialist, it might actually be in your job role to keep up with alumni and to potentially go to meetings or get coffee with them. It might actually be in your scope of practice, and this scenario is actually part of your job role to go and do these things. However, for other job roles, this might be outside your scope of practice, A, to maintain ongoing contact with alumni, and B, to develop an additional relationship outside your professional practice with the client. And so then you would be looking at developing a dual relationship, i.e. a friendship or a personal relationship with the client, which that you should not do. So in this scenario, it's going to depend on what your scope of practice is and whether or not this would be appropriate for you to go get coffee with the client. And also seeking supervision around that. And anytime a client asks you to do something, even if you say no and you keep that boundary, I would definitely encourage you to still talk to your supervisor and say, hey, I got an email from a client. She invited me to coffee. I just want to let you know that I emailed her back and said, no, thank you. I'm maintaining my professional boundary, or whatever seemed to best honor that relationship with the client that you had, where it was worded in a way that was authentic to you and also therapeutic, and that you let your supervisor know. You could even perhaps CC them on the email, so that the supervisor is aware that there was perhaps some pushing of boundaries by the client, and then what you did in response. Scenario number 5, you see the name of a client scheduled to admit and you recognize her as a friend from high school. So in this situation, it's going to depend. If you're, my age, and you have not been in high school for years and years and years, and you didn't stay in contact with any high school friends, and you haven't talked to them at all, you would immediately form your supervisor and then figure out, would this in fact be uncomfortable for the client? Would there be a dual relationship? Does this seem appropriate? How much contact would you have with the client when she came in, to decide whether it would even be appropriate for the client to admit in that relationship? If this is somebody that you have like a current friendship with still and maintain that friendship, there would be much more clear lines that this would not be appropriate for the client to admit and work with you. And so there's a spectrum in terms of whether or not or how clear the boundary violation is, and that's why it's really important that you don't just make this decision and not talk to others about it, that you consult with other people around these scenarios, that you let your supervisor know and be aware that because of the ethical dilemma, and they can be slippery slopes, that you are having other people be in partnership with you with this decision making, so you're not biased in any way, and it's clear, and other people can have a different lens in how they're viewing the situation as well in consultation. And so in this case, it's going to sort of be depending on what kind of relationship you still had. You did have the comfort level for the client, of course, including them in any discussion, letting them know there might be a possible conflict, dual relationship, and also consulting and figuring out with your supervisor if it would be appropriate for this client to admit. Scenario number 6, a client who you know is very vulnerable due to mental health trauma issues asks for an exception to a wayside rule. So if a client is asking for an exception or rule, again, you're going through and you're running through, is it within your scope of practice to make decisions on whether there should be exceptions to rules? Does that exception to a rule benefit you somehow, or is it for the benefit of the client? If it benefits the client, but also is potentially unfair to other clients, who are you involving in that consultation process so you can make sure that the decision to grant an exception to the client is unbiased and fair to others? We also do want to make sure that client needs are met, and that things are individualized. And so there isn't a hard, fast rule that clients never get exceptions to rules. In fact, we try to individualize things as much as possible. However, when we are granting exceptions, again, it's very important to form those in consultations with other people, asking yourself, how would I feel if other professionals found out about this exception? Is this something I feel comfortable charting? And who have I discussed? And is it within my scope of practice? And is it best for client care? Scenario number 7. You are at a public policy work-related meeting in the community, and a professional from another agency wants to talk about a client you have in common. So this is an issue, a boundary violation related to client confidentiality. We do uphold federal confidentiality laws, CFR 42, as well as HIPAA laws, and Minnesota Data Privacy Act, High Tech, and a slew of others. So it's very important that we maintain client confidentiality at all times. Additionally, it sounds like you're in the community, and so even if you had a release of information to be able to discuss with this other professional within the agency, the ability to discuss this particular client you have in common, you're in a public atmosphere. It sounds like you're in a public policy work-related meeting and there's others around. So anytime you're discussing therapeutic concerns or collaterals, you want to make sure that that's done in a private room, private setting, so it can't be overheard. So you'd want to make sure you had the client consent via a written release of information in order to talk to the other person from the other agency. If you did not have a release to talk about this client, you could not disclose that the client was in fact at Wayside or was a client at all. So we would not be able to confirm or deny to the other agency that that is a client. If something happens like that, again, we'd want to make sure that we inform the client when we got back that somebody attempted to talk about them and that you upheld confidentiality, so we let the client know immediately when we returned to the building that happened, but we upheld the confidentiality, or if there had been a release sign, that we did disclose what we did disclose, and that we charted that and tracked that. And we would also, again, if you have any other questions or concerns or need consultation, that you sought that with your supervisor. Scenario number 8. A client who is an artist gives you a gift of a piece of art she made from things she found while walking in the forest. So this is can be a tricky one. First of all, we want to take into account cultural competence as well, because some cultures really are incredibly hurt when you do not accept a gift. And so we do want to think about where is the client coming from and what does gift giving mean to them. On the other hand, it says that this client is an artist. So that means that that's their profession. It also means that they make money from their art. So if this is a person who frequently sells little pieces of art for $800, that art that they just gave you could be worth a lot of money, and therefore you might have some sort of monetary gain by accepting the gift. And so in that case, you definitely want to consult, because again, that rule of thumb is if it's over $10 or the value of the object is over $10, you want to say no. I have some colleagues who just make it easier than that. They don't accept gifts. And then some colleagues who will even have a lower number and say anything that's worth more than $5. And so we definitely, though, regardless, want to inform your supervisor immediately if a gift is given to you. You want to document it. And then you may even want to disclose the reason for accepting the gift, such as it was a gift that was valued, and in this case, if it was art pieces that she found while walking in the forest, the items themselves may have no intrinsic value, and so then it's going to depend on what's the value of it as art. And so if there's any monetary gain to you, what is your purpose of accepting that gift? If it's about the client, it has relatively no value, you may choose potentially to accept the gift. But again, these things can be really tricky, and I ultimately really encourage you to seek consultation, particularly when you first start out in the job and you're unsure of what to do. Scenario number 9. A client really wants to see a specific psychiatrist while she's in treatment. We have some information about past unethical behavior by this psychiatrist. So in this situation, there are client rights that you definitely want to review. Client rights can be found in the admission packet. They can also be found in several different manuals when you get on the job. And client rights are also posted behind every clinician door. So definitely review client rights, because this particular scenario has to do with the client's right to choose who they receive treatment services from, including other medical professionals. In this case, the client really wants to see a specific psychiatrist, and it sounds like we as an agency have some information about past unethical behavior by the psychiatrist. So we would, of course, help the client with the referral they want to go to. However, one of the things we could choose to do is show the client either the psychiatry board website, which shows perhaps the unethical practice complaints that are documented on the board, so the client can make an informed decision about who they want to go through. If the client still wants to go to the psychiatrist, again, they have the right to choose who they receive treatment services and medical services from, and so you'd want to help facilitate the client's ability to see the psychiatrist of their choice. Scenario number 10. A client is wrestling with whether or not to stay with her partner. From what you have heard from her about her partner, you don't think they have a very healthy relationship. So this is a couple issues. One is this is a scope of practice issue. If you're having an urge to talk to the client and give your opinion about her relationship, is that within your scope of practice to give client relationship advice or opinion? Or where are you coming from in terms of this conversation? Are you feeling like this is reminding you of a past relationship that you've been in and you had similar problems and you're feeling hooked? Or perhaps there's some feelings of some transference or countertransference that you're experiencing. And so these are areas where, from the sound of it, you have an opinion about the client's life. And I would really encourage you to think about whether or not it's helpful for the client to disclose that opinion, whether it's in your scope of practice to disclose that opinion, and who is benefiting that you're disclosing that opinion. So I want to review very quickly our Wayside House Code of Ethics, because we are all bound at day one of employment with the Code of Ethics for Wayside. As a member of the Wayside House staff, I will place the welfare of our client and matters affecting them above all other concerns. So it's really important that the things that we do while we're at work are done in a way that it's ultimately in the best interest of the client. To this end, I will provide the highest quality of service to all wayside clients regardless of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, disability, age, marital status, public assistance status, socioeconomic status, or ex-offender status. So we want to be non-discriminatory in our practices and deliver highest quality of service to everyone. I will do no harm to a client, either physically or psychologically. I will not verbally assault, ridicule, endanger a client, nor will I allow other clients or staff to do so. If you're feeling yourself getting triggered by a client, and when I say triggered, I mean that you're getting hooked, you're getting easily angry, irritated by the client, that's a warning sign that a boundary violation might be taking place, that you might be starting to develop your own old strategies, maladaptive strategies of your own, where you might potentially yell or say something to the client you would otherwise regret. In that case, stop what you're doing. If you're finding yourself getting irritated or angry, stop what you're doing and go seek consultation. Maybe ask somebody else to help the client for a second while you can take some deep breaths, and seek consultation how to move forward with that client, because we do not want to end up in a situation where we verbally assault, ridicule, or endanger a client, say things that are hurtful, or physically or psychologically hurt a client. I will urge changes in the lives of clients only in their own behalf and in the interest of promoting their recovery. I will not otherwise press them to adopt beliefs and behaviors which reflect my value system rather than their own. So, for example, a common one is in the recovery community, we have some individuals who found recovery in different ways. Some people find recovery, for example, using like a 12-step self-help model, and they feel very proud and they feel like that has been really helpful for them. If we have clients who that model does not work for them, we would not pressure them to adopt our beliefs or behaviors, or if we felt like that was our value system. At Wayside, we want to really encourage them to find a recovery path that is their own and that works for them and that their value system. It could be something like well-briety or smart recovery, maybe through their own spiritual community or church. Find whatever works for them in the way that works for them, but we don't want to press them to adopt our beliefs or our behaviors or only follow our own value system. I will not engage in any activity that could be construed as exploitation of clients for personal gain, be it sexual, financial, social, or otherwise. You may not and cannot enter in a sexual or romantic relationship with a client. Do not enter into a financial relationship with a client. Do not buy things from a client. Do not have clients buy things from you. Don't engage in a social, go outside of work in a social way with clients. Or any other activity that could be construed as exploitation for your own personal gain. I will not attempt to use my authority over a client in a coercive manner to meet my own ends. I will not promote dependency on me, but help clients to empower themselves. That example of your car not working and then you going and finding the client to look at your car because you know they're a mechanic, that's an attempt to use your authority over the client in order to get your own ends, meet your own ends. And there's many more examples of that. So if you have questions about what that one means, certainly talk with your supervisor, and of course my door is always open. I will not promote dependency on me, but help clients to empower themselves. So for example, if a client is constantly asking you to make all their phone calls for them, recognizing that if you did that each and every time, the client is not learning the skills on how to make their own phone calls. And so in that case, how do you partner with the client, power with, to help them make phone calls and learn that skill? And so that you're not causing them to be dependent on you, so that they wouldn't be able to do that, make phone calls when they leave. I will remain aware of my skills and limitations and will be willing to recognize when it is in the best interest of my clients to release or refer them to another program or individual. So in this case, looking at your own area of expertise and your scope of practice and your colleagues' scope of practice and their expertise, and starting to realize or recognize when potentially the client may need more or a different level of expertise than you or one of your colleagues has. I will not name or give information about a client, former client, or family member except to other Wayside House staff as required for client services or when specifically authorized by the client or in compliance with laws and regulations. So again, this is about client confidentiality and maintaining client confidentiality at all times, except in the case of limitations to client confidentiality, such as mandated reporting. And then there are some very limited exceptions to client confidentiality, or when authorized specifically through the client with the release of information. I will actively protect a client's privacy and rights of confidentiality from unauthorized disclosure by others. So, for example, you want to make sure that you're protecting client confidentiality, not just with your own actions, but also the actions of your colleagues. I understand and agree to defend and follow both the spirit and letter of Wayside's policy on client rights and to respect the rights and views of other professionals. And so it's very important that you do read the client rights and understand them. Again, I noted earlier where they can be found in the agency, and that's something that you do relatively early in your orientation at Wayside House so that you can follow the spirit and letter of both the policy and the client rights. I understand that a therapeutic relationship does not end when a client no longer receives Wayside recovery services. To protect clients from exploitation, I will have no personal, business, sexual, or social relationship with a client or former client within a minimum of 1 year after termination of all Wayside service to the client. So this is the Wayside Code of Ethics. For many people who are licensed, there can be varying degrees of when is it appropriate to have a relationship outside of your professional relationship. Some licenses would say never. It is never okay once you've been a professional in somebody's life to then engage in some sort of romantic or sexual or other type of relationship, business or otherwise, outside of the professional setting once you've been in a professional relationship with the client. There are other minimum years for different licensors. It's really important if you have a license that you understand and know when that is for you, and go by the most stringent level of ethics for you and your profession. I will not refer Wayside clients to any services in which I have a financial or personal interest within a minimum of 1 year after termination of Wayside House services to the client. Any exception to this policy will only be granted by Wayside's Director of Clinical Services in consultation with Wayside's Chief Executive Officer and based on the best interest of the client. Again, this says 1 year, and I know plenty of different scopes of practice that would say never. It is never okay. And then also, there's also different years that you want to take a look at depending on your license level and what your scope of practice is or what your role is in the agency. But for Wayside Code of Ethics, it says 1 year. I would go by the most stringent level of ethics that you are personally aware of and have to uphold for your level of license or job role. I will neither accept nor give gifts of significant monetary value from a client, former client, or her family within at least 2 years after the termination of services. So, for example, if you get a envelope in the mail after you've discharged a client and it's from their family and in it is 2 Vikings tickets, you know that's significant monetary value. And even though the family might be sending that to you for thanks for whatever they perceive as help or whatever you did in relationship with the client, I would suggest that you seek consultation. And more than likely, because Viking tickets are a significant monetary value, that would be something that you would not be accepting from that family. It says within at least 2 years after termination of services. And again, you want to have the most stringent ethical standards. And for some professionals, I know they would say they have a rule that they would not ever accept gifts after they've been a professional of significant monetary value. In my personal use of alcohol or other mood-altering drugs, I will serve as a responsible role model for clients, staff, and the community. If I am chemically dependent, I will maintain abstinence while employed at Wayside. I will demonstrate responsible concern for the well-being of clients, staff, and Wayside Recovery Center by appropriately addressing possible manifestations of illness or unethical conduct in colleagues. So if you notice any of your colleagues are acting in a way that's unprofessional or unethical, or you notice that perhaps they're having issues that are affecting their professionalism or their responsibilities on the job, please alert your supervisor or their supervisor immediately. I will accept responsibility for my continuing education and professional development as part of my commitment to provide quality care to Wayside Recovery Center clients. So in this case, it's very important for you to continue to educate yourself on issues such as ethics, client confidentiality, cultural responsiveness, gender-specific work, crisis intervention, a slew of other things that you want to seek training for and continue your education in these areas. And it is your responsibility, and you accept that responsibility, to continue your education and provide ongoing training to yourself. You can also ask your supervisor for more training, and being aware of what level of training you're at and where are areas that you need more training in. That concludes our boundaries presentation. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always ask myself or go to your supervisor. My door is always open. Thank you and have a good day.